Shalom and welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing media bias against Israel and what could be done against it. Sorry, can I start that again? About it rather than against it. Thank you. Cool. Shalom and welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing why the mainstream media is biased against Israel and how we can confront it. Warm welcome to the programme. And my guest today is Michael McCann, Director of Israel-Britain Alliance. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Simon.
And also Robin Benson. So welcome to the programme, guys. I'll start off with you, Michael, because we're here to talk about your latest campaign, which is to confront media bias within the BBC. Why this topic and why this time? Well,
for any of your viewers, Simon, who have ever shouted at the radio and been infuriated by what they see in the television news, or they've went online at the BBC and they've been angered by what they've read, this is the time for them to stand up and to be heard. We know that there's been bias within the BBC against Israel for a long, long time. But you can't just attack a media outlet. We cherish free speech in our country. We cherish the right for people to be able to say what they feel and what they believe in. And that's allowed across all media outlets, although it's different for broadcast media than newspapers. But the situation with the BBC is the bias is now utterly blatant. We've looked back over a 2-year period, and on 8 occasions from August 2016 to date, there have been stories in the BBC News which have reported on the attacks that Israel faces in its southern border from Hamas, other terror factions. In 7 out of those 8 reports, the BBC News item has started with the Israeli military response and not with the chronological order of events. In addition, over that same period, there were 19 attacks on Israel, including 4 from the Sinai by ISIS. I mean, how many people would know that Israel faces a threat from ISIS, which were not reported at all by the BBC? Now, the line has to be drawn in the sand because the BBC is an organisation which we pay for through our taxes and through the licence fee. And it means that when news is misreported, it gives people a false picture of a very important part of our world. Given that the BBC has a public duty to report impartially and to inform and educate its audience, it's failing in that key responsibility. And that's what we are bringing to its attention. The difference between our campaign and the normal BBC complaints procedure is the BBC complaints procedure puts you in a silo as an individual. But we can now react individually, and people can join our campaign at www.israelbritain.org.uk/BBC, and they can send a detailed letter of complaint to their MP, who you're then asking in turn to send that complaint to the chairman of the BBC board, Sir David Clemente, and asking him to look at the evidence that has been provided. And that is really important. We're giving people an opportunity to put all those days at shouting at the radio, shouting at the television, reading things you're unhappy with from the BBC online, giving you a voice to make sure your frustrations can be heard.
Absolutely. And, you know, Robin, this is something that I know that you've worked on over a number of years, and this is something that does concern a lot of those Christians who support Israel, and the distortion of the facts, the misinformation, putting news out of its context of actually what's happening. But the BBC is very much a trusted organisation, is considered a kind of national institution. So how come they seem to get it so wrong when it comes to Israel?
I think part of the answer to that question is that they are employing reporters in the different areas that they report on the Middle East situation, who, maybe putting it politely, are ignorant. You know, they actually land in the Middle East, in Israel, without any proper background briefing onto the whole story. I mean, there was a prime example on the ITV news last night. Tom Bradby introduced a piece on the current situation with Jeremy Corbyn, but he introduced it in terms of the conflict within Israel with its Arab neighbours, and the historical introduction was just a load of nonsense. You know, he'd moved the legitimacy of Israel as a modern nation state from post-World War I treaties to the United Nations in 1947-48, and said that that was the legitimate reason that Israel existed. Well, that's a load of baloney. You know, and if you know the history, which sadly most people in this country don't anymore, if they're a certain, you know, age and generation, if they don't know the history, they'll just accept whatever the BBC says, Channel 4, ITV, all the rest of them who are doing similar things of misreporting or not, as Michael has said, giving the complete background picture as to why something has happened. And folk, because they more or less trust the media, particularly the TV media and the radio media, they still trust them to a high degree, just accept this as fact, when often it is very questionable, and in many cases it's an actual twisting or a downright lie, because there's an agenda being put forward by the broadcaster.
Yeah. Michael, I saw a news report on Sky News yesterday afternoon, and what shocked me so much is, again, talking about Jeremy Corbyn and the row surrounding anti-Semitism within the party, and this failure to adopt this Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition on anti-Semitism. And the Sky News reporter was clearly interviewing someone who was very supportive of Jeremy Corbyn, but every time he had a sentence, he referred to Israel as being an apartheid state, and the journalist didn't question him once or pick it up, and that makes me really angry. How important is it that journalists have integrity when it comes to reporting the facts and the news about Israel, and to challenge facts and allegations made against Israel that can't be backed up?
Well, I think there's an important thing that your viewers should know, and the difference between the media that we get in newspapers and the difference between in broadcast media. Newspapers are allowed to be biased. They can show their favouritism towards, for example, the Daily Mirror traditionally towards the Labour Party, Daily Telegraph, Daily Mail towards the Conservative Party, although Brexit might throw that all up in the air. But the bottom line is they're allowed to be biased in their editorial, and as long as they make it clear the perspective they're coming from. The difference with broadcast media is that has a duty to be impartial and to report the news impartially. So therefore, someone being interviewed, and I saw the interview you referred to yesterday as well, which suggests that someone's got a point of view, is fine. But surely the journalist's responsibility in terms of being part of a broadcaster, which is to be impartial and is to inform and educate, that's part of their role, not just the BBC. You would imagine that all of them have the same type of objective, is to challenge statements which clearly are inside that individual's head and aren't, you know, in any way justified by the facts. And that is what's really disconcerting. It doesn't just happen, once in a while. It happens all the time, and that's what's really, really disconcerting. And I think with the BBC in particular, because Jon Snow on Channel 4 is equally as bad. The people are probably watching at home going, and agreeing with me entirely, but he's equally as bad. But the BBC, I think, I wrote in a blog recently, is as close to a secular religious organisation as you'll ever find. I don't mean that to be an offensive. It's an oxymoron, of course, but it is revered by a lot of people. Some people think that whatever comes out of the BBC, it's true. And the problem that gives us, and it links into anti-Semitism in a different way, because if you keep on feeding a narrative to people which says that Israel is the aggressor, Israel is responsible for killing children, Israel is responsible for killing innocent people, then people will develop a hatred towards Israel. And given that it's a Jewish state, it doesn't take a hop, skip and a jump to say that you dislike Jewish people, which in turn becomes anti-Semitism, which in turn becomes an even greater problem. And that's the risk that we face if we don't challenge the BBC. Now, the thing is, I can watch a BBC news report and I can disagree with it, but I can take the view they're still entitled to say that. Perfectly legitimate. But what they can't do is they can't put stories upside down, leading with a negative against Israel when it's not true. And we have now built up a dossier of evidence, And I already know because the emails are flooding into the BBC. We need more, but they're flooding in. And many MPs are doing what their constituents ask, and they're writing to Sir David Clemente and saying, well, here's an evidence-based complaint. What is your response?
And Michael, do you want to introduce your new campaign video?
Yeah, well, we managed to get a new up-and-coming journalist to do our most recent campaign video. And you'll notice within it, we've tried to make it as engaging as possible, but crucially, it focuses in on the facts. It's not just my opinion. It's an analysis of what the BBC have done and have put on there, and we get that information from an organisation called BBC Watch, who I really do record my thanks to. Watch the video, and then please go to our website and join our campaign.
The terror group Hamas has fired 200 rockets into civilian neighbourhoods in Israel. The attacks on Sderot, Beersheba and Ashkelon forced families with children and babies into air raid shelters in the middle of the night. That's how the BBC should report attacks on Israel, because it's factual and impartial. The BBC has a legal obligation to provide impartial news and information to help people understand and engage with the world around them. However, when it comes to the BBC's coverage of Israel, it fails. There are many examples of their failures. For a start, they never describe Hamas as a terror organisation. But let's drill down into one specific failure. In the last 2 years, there have been 8 BBC reports of Hamas and other factions firing rockets into civilian areas of Israel. In 7 of those reports, each BBC article or broadcast either headlined or opened with the Israeli military response rather than the chronological order of events. Why is this important? Because the BBC's reporting allows people to reach the conclusion that Israel is the aggressor and the people of Gaza are being routinely attacked by the Israeli army. That's the wrong answer. But there is another feature of editorial decision-making at the BBC that diminishes its legal obligation to inform and educate. In the same 2-year period, there were 19 additional rocket attacks on Israel, 15 from Gaza and 4 carried out from the Sinai by ISIS. The BBC didn't report any of these attacks. And by not reporting these attacks, the BBC audience is being deprived of crucial information that would inform and educate them. It would help the audience understand the multiple existential threats that Israel faces every day. Our world is a complex place. Fake news is a real problem, but you wouldn't expect fake news from the BBC. The irony is that the BBC is promoting itself as the antidote to fake news when it's part of the problem. Check this out.
Fake news is lies and propaganda told for a political or commercial purpose which deploys digital technology, social media, new networks.
We pay for the BBC through our taxes, and it's time that the corporation is held to account. It's time to raise these issues with our politicians. The BBC and Ofcom complaints procedures are not fit for purpose. However, the BBC board, the custodians of its public purposes, must be held to account because they are not doing their job. Join our campaign today at www.israelbritain.org.uk/BBC and email your MP, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport and the BBC. Let's make the BBC honest again. I am Simon Barrett from Revelation TV, standing up for the truth with the Israel-Britain Alliance.
All I can do is encourage you to join that campaign because you know, it's so important, and you know, as a broadcaster, it's so important that we report honestly what is happening in Israel and the Middle East today. Robin, reminds me of a particular story. Back in 2014, I was working with a very prominent former supporter of the Palestinian Authority in the PLO, and we entered into the BBC headquarters for an interview with BBC Radio 5 Live. And what you picked up then, because he was there to defend Israel and say, actually, the narrative that you support is actually wrong, this is the truth, they brought out Jeremy Bowen, who was their kind of Middle East editor there, and all the kind of big shots to actually gun down the particular guest that I was introducing them to the BBC, to such an extent that after about 20 minutes they closed the interview down because he was actually winning. And it almost seems as if within the BBC itself there's this institutionalized bias against Israel when it comes to reporting. So any journalist coming in, reporting on this one, already knows the views and the opinions of the BBC, and therefore we see this bias.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think, going back to what you were saying before we watched that excellent video clip, to me it raises the whole issue, what is journalism in the 21st century? Because growing up, my understanding of journalism was to report the facts. Whereas now it seems that a lot of journalists, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them are actually putting forward either the opinions of the media organization that they work with, or their own personal opinions, or a combination of both. So that you have situations like these well-known household names that appear in the BBC and the other media networks, who are actually constantly, day after day after day, ploughing this furrow of painting Israel and by extension the Jewish people and those that support Israel and the Jewish people in a negative light. And it's personal opinion, it's not factual journalistic reporting. And so you have the whole issue, how are these people being trained? Yes, I agree with you, Simon, that some of them coming into media organizations like the BBC realize, if I don't report the way they want it reported, I'm either not going to get the job in the first place, or I'm not going to make any progress within the organization. So they sell their soul out in order, to make a name for themselves, as well as supporting the organization. And it's the whole issue of journalism seems to have gone down the plug hole as far as factual reporting is concerned.
Absolutely. Michael, isn't there a great danger when it comes to kind of media bias, particularly from the broadcasters, is that it can actually lead, and has actually led, to an increase in Jew hatred? Because if there's an incident in Israel and the Israeli government has to defend its own citizens, take example, Israel's war against Hamas in 2014, Israel had no other option but to defend herself against Hamas's rockets and missiles, then finding out later they had a whole network of terror tunnels that they were planning to use to kidnap a whole number of Israelis. And yet Israel had to send in her troops in order to actually protect her citizens. But when it comes down to actually coverage, like we showed in your excellent video, IBA, there seems to be a major problem in terms of the mainstream media's focus when it comes to particular flashpoint of conflict, indicating that Israel is the aggressor, which then inflames public opinion across Europe, and we see attacks on the Jewish community. Isn't it time that major news corporations understood the responsibility they need to take when it comes to covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the implication of biased reports leads to an increase in anti-Semitism? Well,
look, let me give you my answer to that. The position is that we have got rules for broadcasters in the UK. If you go on and watch Fox News, for example, some people watching Revelation TV will enjoy Fox News and enjoy the product it puts out, but it can't be described as an impartial broadcaster in any way, shape or form. The BBC has a duty to be an impartial broadcaster, and so do the other broadcasters in our country. The rules are there for a reason. Now, a lot of people don't like this analogy, but I'm going to use it. And I would take it back to one of the most, someone who used media techniques, and go back to, in the very early stages of modern media, go back to Goebbels and the Nazi Party and what he did with sending his message around. I would draw the analogy with that part of history, except to say that the media product now is so much more sophisticated and so much more detailed in terms of how you can get a hold of that news, whether it be in the written form, whether it be broadcast form, the radio, whether it be online. You can actually search out the type of media that you want to hear, which is by, if you watch programmes like Homeland, you'll see that how it can, even in a drama, how they can portray it, and it's all obviously linked into real life. So therefore, that's why it's so important for the media to get it right, because it does play into a narrative which is frightening. I mean, I watched a BBC programme with Victoria Derbyshire where there was a couple on it, Mark Lewis and the Mandy Blumenthal.
Yes.
I think it was and it was appalling. Because clearly Victoria Derbyshire had been given a briefing, and I'll be quite upfront, she was given a briefing by an extremist, a trot within the BBC, because they actually accused Mark and Mandy of being members of the UK Zionist Party. It doesn't exist. Absolutely. It doesn't exist.
Yes.
And then when, you know, I think it was Mandy responded and saying, what are you talking about? Oh, well, I've clearly got that wrong. So a massive blunder she makes in an interview. And then she just moves on as if it never happened. Utterly disgraceful report, and that was one of the days I was shouting at the BBC. Because the position is, and I mentioned it earlier, here is the equation. You print narratives, you tell people stories which aren't true, which are factually incorrect. People then develop a hatred of that country and its people. And then people then develop a hatred for that country and its people and the diaspora. And that's why many Jewish people in our country are seriously contemplating, not just saying it for effect, seriously contemplating leaving Britain. How disgraceful is that in the 21st century, in 2018, that someone would have to make a judgment like that because they're frightened about living in the society that they've been born into and they've been brought up into. It's extraordinary. But and the BBC has to be the first line of attack because it's seen as being the flagship of public service broadcasting.
Yeah. Can I just bring a question in here because of your sort of political background? Often the BBC, when they are challenged, seem to fall back on the foundation that, well, this is what the Foreign and Commonwealth Office takes as a line on this issue. And if you challenge that, then this is what the UN takes as a line on this issue. So you've got a sort of like a three-way tussle going on as to who actually takes responsibility for what is being churned out by the media. How can we combat that when the BBC is saying, well, actually, the British Foreign Office is saying this, so we're just reporting the line that the government is taking? I mean, how can we wrestle with that one?
There's a huge irony in that because you get a situation where any time as a politician I was asked to participate in a programme about a controversial issue, and it wasn't just something that had happened maybe in your area which you were just commenting on. If it was about an issue between higher taxes and lower taxes, for example, then you have two sides debating the point and it's up to the viewer or the listener to take a point of view about who they agree with. That's perfectly acceptable and it's perfectly reasonable. The irony is, if they say that, yeah, this is what the UN says, but they ought to have someone else who will come on with a different point of view. And for example, the United Nations is, and what Donald Trump's now doing about UNRWA, I've been arguing that for years. I don't want poor people in penury and who are Palestinians to be left in poverty or to have terrible lives. The opposite. I want them to have great lives. But the fact is, UNRWA isn't delivering that. So, it's right that we challenge these issues, but there's a huge irony, Simon, and it's this. We are now getting responses back from members of Parliament to their constituents who've passed them back to the IBA, and they're saying, I have written to Sir David Clementi and I'm raising these points with him. Now, and some MPs are coming back and saying, I'm not going to contact the BBC because we can't interfere, the government can't interfere. And our supporters are having to remind the MPs that they're writing to them as their MPs and not as members of the government. It's ironic that we some of those back from the Labour Party members, which we had to remind them that they're not actually a member of the government. So I don't know where they're coming from with that at all. So we're in a situation now where there's a history to the BBC and there's a reverence about the BBC, which means that people put it in a pedestal, and it's not entitled to be in that pedestal because it's breaking its founding rules and it's not delivering on impartiality and informing and educating the public.
Absolutely. Let's have a look now at an excellent CBN report on an AP reporter who was exposing media bias within the AP.
Well, today, first-hand account of what we've been reporting for years, that news organizations often show bias against Israel, and it happened a lot during this summer's war with Hamas. A former reporter with the Associated Press is blowing the whistle. Chris Mitchell has his story from Jerusalem.
During the summer of 2014, Israel and Hamas fought for 50 days. Reporters from all over the globe covered the fighting, often filling their stories with conflicting information and questionable reporting. After the war, former AP reporter Mati Friedman wrote an article called An Insider's Guide to the Most Important Story on Earth.
And I decided at the end of the summer to write an essay looking at what has gone wrong through the lens of my own experiences.
For 7 years, Friedman reported for the Associated Press, a giant news organization that provides information to many other media outlets around the world. He says the AP and the mainstream press suffer from two malfunctions. One, Israel gets too much coverage, and two, the press has taken sides.
The mainstream press corps here has largely adopted an advocacy role. They've decided to play a political role in the conflict. They've decided to lobby for the side that they think is right, and political decisions are disguised as journalistic decisions.
Friedman says Hamas took advantage of the bias.
The strategy is to terrorize Israeli civilians using rockets, provoke an Israeli response, put civilians in Gaza in between the Israelis and the Hamas fighters by storing rockets in civilian basements, in the basements of mosques, in schools, and we've seen all those things documented this summer. And then having the huge international media contingent in Gaza film the civilian casualties, not the armed men, and use those pictures to spark outrage against Israel abroad, and that will prevent Israel from acting to the full extent of its strength against Hamas. That's the strategy. I think any intelligent person can see it, and yet it's not covered like that.
But the Associated Press refuted Friedman's claim. It issued a statement that said in part, his arguments have been filled with distortions, half-truths, and inaccuracies, both about the recent Gaza war and more distant events. His suggestion of AP bias against Israel is false. The AP denies Friedman's claim that the AP and other media ignored or underreported Hamas firing from mosques, schools, and UN facilities. But Friedman says the world is getting a skewed version of what actually is happening.
The story is, if you read between the lines and if you read the lines themselves, the story is that Israel is faced with a clear moral choice and is making the wrong choice. Israel could have peace, but it chooses war. That story is false.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And Robin, why does it appear that so many of our mainstream media corporations fall into the traps of the likes of Hamas or these Islamist terrorist organizations, and they become part of the problem because they use asymmetrical warfare? Take Hamas, for example. They use women and children as human shields. They fire their rockets and missiles from hospitals and schools. And, you know, they do not abide by the Geneva Convention when it comes to military warfare. And so therefore there's a great danger, isn't there, that the journalists go along with the Hamas narrative, and that then has a direct result on Western foreign policy and results in governments taking up more hostile positions towards Israel, and also affects relationships between, say, Britain and the State of Israel.
Well, those who observe what these Western media representatives do in the situations where there's conflict between Israel and particularly Hamas in the Gaza Strip, or even with the Palestinian Authority, point out that these terrorist organizations have got well-financed, well-oiled public relations departments that will grab hold of the Western media representative and actually take them, escort them to where this incident occurred, but there'll be a minder there with them from the organization, making sure that the broadcaster really only reports what the terrorist organization or the representative wants reported. And in the end, you come to the conclusion that either these folk are totally gullible or they're scared. They've been told by their media organization, get a report, and they're too scared to report the opposite or the truth of what's actually happened in the situation. And we've had, multiple incidents of where Israel has responded to an attack from the Gaza Strip, that the medical authorities in the Gaza Strip have given X number of people who have been killed. That then is broadcast worldwide. Israel is painted in a bad light. And then a couple of days later, 2/3 of these people who were killed were actually terrorists belonging to the organization. But the original story has already gone around the world umpteen times before that, and therefore Israel is already in a bad light, and people either don't listen, or they don't take any notice, or they don't believe when Israel reports the facts. And so the reporters actually become puppets. And their media organizations, by extension, are puppets for terrorists. And we live with the reality of that, with Israel then being painted as the baddie constantly because of that.
There's a classic example of that, the point that's just been made, that Robin's just made, which is that you remember during the recent skirmishes on the Gaza-Israel border, that Israel was accused of killing a child. And then, now leaving aside the basic question is, why do you take a child to a riot?
Exactly.
Leaving aside that question, the baby, it was then subsequently revealed that Hamas had put pressure on the family to say it was Israel's fault because of the tear gas that Israel was using to try and disperse the riot. But the child, tragically, the baby had a congenital condition, which meant that whatever circumstances were involved, it exacerbated it, and the child died. Absolutely tragic. But I mean, I've got to be honest with you, I've got 2 kids. My mum and dad had 5 kids. I never in a million years would have imagined that my mum and dad would have taken me to a riot where I would be in danger, and I certainly wouldn't have taken any of my children to a riot. So therefore, rather than the BBC question, or any organisation, Channel 4, ITV, whatever, questioning that point, they will once again put the fire on Israel. And it's utterly disgraceful. There's one other point I could make to also support Robin's thesis that he's just laid out there. Journalists going to Hamas are under the control of Hamas, particularly when it's in a military situation, military operations are taking place. If they don't report what Hamas likes, their credentials are removed. Now, that was in place in 2014 for Operation Protective Edge. I remember being briefed on that. And you also get a situation where, and this is where I really feel it comes out, Jon Snow. Jon Snow is just incredible. He interviewed Mark Regev recently about the Gaza-Israel situation. Mark Regev was completely down the line, stating the facts. Hamas is a terrorist organisation, and Jon Snow was getting visibly upset, not as a journalist, but as if it was that issue that he cared about in his heart of hearts, about the poor Palestinians. But not once did he recognise or take on board the point that Hamas are terrorists who are causing these problems. And that's the extraordinary state of affairs that we've got. And bear in mind that Channel 4, albeit that it gets some of its money from commercial operations, it's also supported by the taxpayer as well.
And, well, just to come back then also to that story with the child, the BBC website, news website, published a picture of the so-called child. And again, not to do, play down the sadness of the child's death, but then a couple of days later, it's proven that the picture of the child that Hamas had used in its Facebook campaign came from a picture of a child in California. So where is the fact-checking? They all bang on, these media organizations, about fact-checking. Where was the fact-checking that went into that? But again, the damage is already done by the time somebody else exposes that this was not even the correct photograph. And it's insanity.
But Michael, isn't one of the big problems also that the fact is that Israel's a democracy, that Western journalists can enjoy coffee, they can enjoy a nice life in Israel and then go to the territories to report what's going on. And the fact is that they're under so much pressure from the Palestinian Authority, and they just have one particular message going out, which is occupation, 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 even though there is no occupation because they're in control of the majority of the towns and cities in Judea under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority. So the journalists get comfortable. And in fact, they know there will be no repercussions if they actually continue with their bias reporting in Israel.
I think it's actually much deeper than that, Simon. I think it's a failure of the system of government, international government, since the declaration was made in 1947 in San Francisco, UN General Council Resolution 181, which said, or which offered the Arab population and the Jewish population of the British Mandate of Palestine a state. Now, I always wanted to make a video. I mean, we did the video for the BBC to campaign together. I wanted to make a video about what would the land have looked like if that deal had been accepted. And you had 2 nations, infant nations, albeit Israel was reborn, starting from scratch and building up again. And I would always have liked to have seen the comparison, if the state of Palestine had it been accepted, if they had produced Nobel Prize winners and they had made a contribution to global excellence in the same way that Israel has. So that's a comparison. But the problem with international governance is that they, forgive me for using a Glasgow phrase here, they bottled They bottled, it might be used in Northern Ireland as well, they bottled making the right decisions, and they made short-term decisions which are still with us decades later. Biggest one is UNRWA, which actually acts against the prospects of peace rather than contributing to peace. And because you've got that international foundation of stupidity, then I think it somehow leads to the international press being able to report this narrative that the poor, downtrodden Arab people who became rebadged as Palestinians are the people that we should be concentrating on.
Let's have a look at the impact of media bias on the general public as we see some protesters supporting the Palestinian cause being interviewed.
There's like a lot of violence going on in Palestine. Really.
So where?
In Palestine.
Where's that?
It's in Israel. It's part of Israel. Israel used to be Palestine, and then it became the state of Israel.
Okay.
And the people who lived there previously have kind of been subjected to a bit of an apartheid.
What, in Israel?
Yeah. Against the Muslim population.
There's an apartheid in Israel?
Yeah.
Right.
The Palestinians have a lot less weapons. The Israelis have a whole, like, their army is very well stocked with kind of weapons and things.
Is that not more of a sign about a country that wants to protect itself? Given that...
Yeah, it could be protecting itself, but it is more of an offensive as opposed to a defensive.
Well then, shouldn't you be speaking with the likes of Hamas who do encourage this, and they have actually said that this is a third intifada and have actually called for this sort of violence they've called it a day of rage.
I don't agree with the violence at all from either side. But
so why are you more inclined to come and here today than say a day when...
the oppressed side.
Would you say that it's right for an oppressed side to be stabbing rabbis in the street? Is that a sign of the oppressed?
No, that's not a right thing to do.
Is it a sign of the oppressed though? Well, stabbing rabbis in the street?
What else can they don't
have said that Abbas. Do you know who Abbas is?
One of them.
He's the leader of the Palestinian Authority.
Okay.
I think you should read up on what he's been saying this week.
I just think that I'm just here to stop the war coalition.
Okay.
People.
Thank you. I really appreciate your input. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Brilliant example of ignorance when it comes down to this conflict of not understanding what's going on, not understanding the facts, and obviously not watching the right programs. Robin, I use that as a classic example of kind of media ignorance, particularly amongst millennials, that here they are protesting against Israel with part of the Stop the War coalition, and don't know anything about the facts of the conflict, didn't even know that the leader of the Palestinian Authority was Mahmoud Abbas. Isn't that the great danger now in particular, is that including so many young people now rely on our broadcast news to get their information, and don't read newspapers, they don't find out what's going on for themselves, and so therefore trust organisations like the BBC and CNN and others to actually report the news properly, and that's where they get their facts and information from.
Yes, I mean, they are getting their facts and information from the BBC and the broadcasters, but I suspect, I mean, I was saying to Michael, to the girl, just keep digging, dear, just keep digging. Because somebody had handed her a massive media shovel, and the hole was just getting bigger and bigger. You could tell by the look on her face, she hadn't got a clue about any of the questions that the reporter was asking her. And you have to feel sorry for her in some senses, because she's embarrassed herself and she's embarrassed the campaign that, that they were putting forward. But it begs the question, I mean, they look like they're university-age young women. So we face the issue that it's not just media, it's these organizations getting into the universities, getting young people like that onto their mailing lists, getting them signed up to their Facebook and their social media sites. And I would suspect that actually those three got more of their information from social media than from the actual media, because they're trotting out lines without understanding, without having the faintest idea what those words, what those statements represent as far as factual or non-factual history. And I mean, it's pathetic. It's so sad, it's pathetic.
And Michael, we often hear when it comes to mainstream news reporting on Israel, quotes such as disproportional use of force, proportionality, and saying, well, this is a number of Palestinians that have been killed in a conflict, this is a number of Israelis, so therefore we are justified in not covering Israel so much because there's less casualties on the Israeli side, primarily because of Israeli technology like the Iron Dome that protects the citizens. So why are we not seeing a kind of news report actually reported within the context of events that have occurred so that the viewer can make up their own mind about what's actually happened?
Yeah, because it's easy. It's easy for a journalist like a Jon Snow or whoever from the BBC who then says, yeah, but the response is disproportionate. And you've always got so little time when you're on a news programme to get a point across. But my response to that would be very simple. Well, tell me what proportionate looks like. So, because a lot of the press coverage of the recent skirmishes in the Gaza-Israel border have been about, well, but there's not been any Israeli casualties. And the inference in making that point is that it'll be okay if there is Israeli casualties. Now, the position that I would press journalists who make those type of points is, well, you tell me what proportionality look like. Does it mean that if 10 Palestinians get killed, there has to be 10 Israeli deaths? Does it mean that there should be more Israeli deaths because they've got a higher quality of defence mechanisms against the attacks they're facing from the Palestinians? Will we discuss a ratio and say that for every 10 Palestinians that are killed, there'll be 1 Israeli killed because they can protect themselves better? And then you get into how stupid that actually sounds. Because then what I would do, if I was offered the opportunity, is just strip it back and say, who is starting the trouble? Who starts the violence? And then, yeah, but the oppressed Palestinian people. And yeah, who oppressed the Palestinian people? It wasn't Israel. Who attacked in the 15th of May 1948? Who attacked the tiny state of Israel? 5 Arab nations. Why did you never report that and tell people the truth? And what worries me about the clip we've just watched and the young women, apart from the fact, look, it's called the folly of youth. It's ignorance, it's a lack of knowledge about the situation. I get that. You can educate people. What really worries me, and I've been saying this for a long, long time, is that young people growing up in our country who watch the news think that there was once a place called Palestine that Israel invaded and took over. And they don't understand that this was a piece of land that was fought over centuries, over millennia, going back to the sacking of Jerusalem in 70 AD, going back to that time and then going through everyone who's took over, and then you go up to sort of more modern times with the Ottoman Empire, and then the First World War and the distribution of land thereafter. And then when people call it, the biggest laugh I get is when people call it a colonial or an imperialist entity. It's actually the reverse of it. Because the British government, shamefully, a Labour government after the war, started breaking up the empire and giving India its independence, and all the different countries got their independence. But outrageously, the Labour government never supported, in the early stages in particular, the new nascent state of Israel. So these are the issues. If you tell untruths, or let me just make it even clearer, if you tell lies to people and it comes from the BBC, they'll believe them. And that's why we've got to tackle it.
But, I mean, just to jump in on that, the Labour government at the time was not only not supporting the foundation of the State of Israel. In the case of Jordan, or Transjordan, it was the army from there was led by a serving British officer and was equipped by Britain. So actually, Britain, when you look at it, the United Kingdom was more or less complicit in an attempt to destroy the infant nation state of Israel. Yeah. And we live with the legacy of that in every sense of the word 70 years later. Yeah. Yeah. And that's, again, something that's not talked about because we don't want to admit that actually the UK is a major part of the problem of what's gone on in the Middle East.
And I just want to pick up a very valid point, and this is one that Israelis make, that whenever there's an attack in Paris by ISIS, or a London attack by ISIS, or New York or somewhere else around the world, they also see this as the wider struggle that Israel faces in the international community, and this is the battle that the West is fighting against Islamic terrorism. But when it comes to Israel, there seems to be this disconnect between what's happening on a kind of global level and what's happening in Israel, and so therefore Israel's not involved in this fight against ISIS and others. This is all about territory, and it gives a misimpression about what's going on. Either you can answer.
It's a misimpression that goes on. Another part of it is, of course, that where are the people in the streets when you hear about a woman from a Muslim state, for example, who, and there was a story recently, I can't remember the precise country, but where the woman was raped and then she was sentenced. Mm-hmm. Where are the people in the streets? Where are the people outside Downing Street? Where are the people with their placards and demanding that this aberration is stopped? Where are the people complaining about Assad, who is chemically bombing his own people? Where are the people in the streets? Where are the people with placards? There must be a factory somewhere in the UK that continually gives a production line of placards about Gaza and blood on your hands. And there is no other conflict that I know of that generates so much of a completely wrong narrative than the history of the Israel-Arab, Israel-Palestinian conflict. But the problem is that our medias feed it. Yeah.
Sorry, Rob, I have to go to this very important video clip, and this is Lord Michael Grade, the former chairman of the BBC, talking about the BBC within the House of Lords and their coverage of Israel.
My Lords, Zionism is the right of the Jewish people to self-determination and is right at the heart of the Balfour Declaration. However, sadly, the term Zionist and Zionism has in some quarters become a proxy for anti-Semitism. I'm not one of those who immediately brands any critic of Israel as an anti-Semite, far from it. However, some critics of Israel leave themselves open to such accusations when they single out Israel for criticism but refuse to contextualize. Suicide bombings, knifings and missiles are daily occurrences for the citizens of Israel who live in a constant state of siege. Surely such acts against innocent civilians require some criticism from those who are continually on Israel's case. But no, there are those critics of Israel who, by their silence on the terror inflicted by Hezbollah and their ilk, condone it. When Israel acts in self-defense, the narrative is distorted to fit their narrative of Zionist aggression. On the 16th of June, recently, 2 Palestinians unprovoked attacked Israeli police officers in Jerusalem with guns and knives, while the third stabbed to death Border Police Staff Sergeant Hadass Malka, aged 23. BBC headline on their news website was, 3 Palestinians killed after deadly stabbing in Jerusalem. BBC eventually changed their headline to Israeli policewoman stabbed to death in Jerusalem. They accepted their mistake and subsequently changed it. Of course, I'm not accusing the BBC journalism of anti-Semitism, but this example demonstrates the drip-drip effect of unqualified, uncontextualised singling out of Israel for criticism. If the BBC can get this wrong, it's little wonder that Israel finds it so hard to put aside the idea that some critics are motivated by something more sinister than political commentary. Meanwhile, 100 years on, as we are hearing, there is much to celebrate in Balfour's visionary declaration. And if I may end on a plug, I recommend everybody to read Lord Turnberg's excellent book.
And we want to hear more of that from the BBC. What is your reaction to what Lord Michael Grade said then? As a former chairman of the BBC, he's criticising his own former corporation here, isn't he, in their coverage of Israel?
I thought it was absolutely extraordinary, and I agreed with every single word they said. And the way that he very succinctly put it was very important. It's about context. Everything's about context. If you just see the final act of someone, for example, punching someone in the street, but you don't know what's come beforehand, whether they're protecting themselves or whatever, you can put out the wrong story. The problem with the BBC and the problem with their BBC complaints procedure is you go into a silo of one, and they can then divide and not do anything about it. And then when they make a change, they make a change which is, quite frankly, nobody knows about, nobody hears about. And therefore, nobody knows that they misreported in the first place. And that's why our campaign jumps over all of that and goes to the heart of the matter. BBC board are responsible for everything the BBC does. Let's hold it to account.
Yeah. Well, down to 2 minutes of the programme, Michael. So, you know, this is your opportunity to have an appeal to our viewers about why it's so important to actually join your campaign to make the BBC honest again.
I'm very grateful for that opportunity, and I have to say that if you're watching this programme and if you've participated in our campaign, thank you. If you haven't, you must do so. But let me go back to the video a few moments ago about the young woman who thought that Israel had invaded Palestine. The problem that we have is the vast majority of our support are older people. It's an older demographic because we come through the history, we understand it. So please, not only participate in this campaign and spread it far and wide, but tell your children about it, tell your grandchildren about it, because that's the demographic who are being fed a diet of fake news. And we have to attack that. And we're doing it on the side of the angels because we are coming from truth. And truth is very, very important when it comes to the news. So please, support our campaign, www.israelbritain.org.uk/BBC. And just follow the simple instructions and you too can make your voice heard. Thank you very much.
And Robin, isn't it so important that we're aware of, when it comes down to mainstream news reporting on Israel, to actually understand and educate ourselves regarding the facts of the conflict so that we know what is truth and what's not truth, and how, for example, media is so important in influencing and formulating opinions about anything, really, a conflict, about Israel, and our relationship with Israel.
I totally agree. I think sadly, when it comes to anything to do with Israel and the Middle East in particular, you need to question what you're seeing. It doesn't matter where the source is. And you need to then find other sources outside of the mainstream media to check. And I just want to totally endorse Michael's campaign. It's brilliant. And get behind it and use it.
Robin, Michael, thank you so much for being my guest on the Middle East Report today. And I just want to thank you for watching this programme. It's so important that we understand the facts of what's going on, that we actually question so much of the reporting that we see about Israel and the Middle East, so that we can stand on that platform of truth. So thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.
Yes, we wanna know where our bells from the flotilla ships are now. The terror business is slow and we urgently need some PR now.
PR, with a B, not with a B.
Our malls are falling from the Egyptian border, we can go far now. But we'd like more guns, 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 please don't take our hobby away. Guns, guns, please don't take our hobby away.
No, we can't get anything right and we are not so in now.
We're not so in.
Yeah, we wanted to be Superman, but we became Mr. Bean now.
We're not so in.
We'll keep using slogans of peace. We know the world is senile. Let's get money for guns, guns, guns. Please don't take Gaza's hobby away.
Guns, guns, please don't take Gaza's hobby away.
Yes, I know that the UN is a stooge of the Arab League now. The condemnation of Israel is ready. I just wait for the signal. The Arabs slaughtered their own people. They are good at doing it big now. But I say to my bonds, cause I shouldn't take their hobby away.
Everybody's entitled to some hobbies, you see.
Yeah, we know about Syria, but they won't let us in to take photos. So here we got bad Israel with Hamas, our permanent motto. It's just humanitarian aid, we know that their virtue is total. So please ignore the guns, guns, guns. We won't take Gaza's hobby away. We won't take Gaza's hobby away. We are brave and we'll get to Gaza by a ship or a rickshaw. So we have lost our touch and we know that we look like a freak show.
But when it comes to Israel, we know how to make it a big show. So get some guns, guns, guns. Please don't take Gaza's hobby away.
Don't take Gaza's hobby away.
Guns, guns, guns. Please don't take Gaza's hobby away.
Guns, guns, guns. Please don't take Gaza's hobby away.
Guns, guns, guns. Please don't take Gaza's hobby away.
Guns, guns, guns.
Please don't take Gaza's hobby away.